time, Canada was a global player and a beacon of hope in a world of emerging from dictatorship and horrors of war. Today, the world is passing us by. As we slide further and further behind the crest of the wave, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Child issued a report this week stating that Canada's tough-on-crime agenda is excessively punitive for youth and is a step backward for the country's human rights record. This is in contravention to the UN Convention of the Rights of a Child. The report was especially critical of the impact the crime bill has on Aboriginal children, who are vastly overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and noted Aboriginal youth are more likely to be jailed than graduate from high school. Canada in 1991 ratified the Child Rights Convention, which is a binding international treaty. The convention states that no child under the age of 18 is to be detained in an adult facility or tried as an adult. Yet Bill C-10 makes it easier for the Crown to raise a child offender to adult court. Apart from the crime bill, but related to its outcome, the convention states, in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child shall be primary consideration. The Harper's government crime legislation does not make the best interests of the child a priority. Instead, is an example of a right-wing ideology of a government that refuses to examine the facts. Bill C-10 is a Tory ominous crime bill that included 9 separate pieces of legislation rolled into one package. Crimes such as possession of marijuana and child sexual assault were all wrapped up in the same legislation. There was little opportunity for discussion or consultation with the public. Any MP who spoke out against the legislation was branded a soft on crime. The bill was given the Orwellian title of the Safe Streets and Communities Act. This turned around the legislation to be proactive and makes the assumption that tough on crime will result in a safer society. In fact, crime has been falling in the past decade while Canadian streets and communities are safer as a result. In spite of the warnings from the United States that its war on drugs and tough on crime approach has been a costly failure, the Harper government pushes ahead with its dogmatic legislation that will cost Canadians to build more prisons, even though it will not make the country any safer. In fact, judging from the American experience, long-term offenders will be released as hardened criminals and pose a greater threat to the public. If incarceration on tough-on-crime policies work, then the United States should be the safest place in the planet. The statistics tell us otherwise. The way things stand, the cost of the federal crime bill will be downloaded on the provinces as more offenders receive provincial jail time, which is 2 years less a day, rather than receive probation or other alternatives to jail. First Nations are aware of the damage crime can have on a community, but we also know that punitive sentences and incarceration create more problems than they ever solve. In Saskatchewan, our jails are crime colleges. They are overcrowded, dangerous, and run by gangs. Young offenders have little choice but to join a gang to protect themselves. When offenders are released from custody, they often return to the same reserve or urban neighborhood from where they came. Their families and neighborhoods are faced with the risk of them reoffending, and when they reoffend, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our people will be on the receiving end of this failed government policy. Aboriginal people are overrepresented in the justice system. According to Statistics Canada, 3.1% of Canadians over the age of 18 years identified themselves as Aboriginal. In spite of this, 18% of those admitted to federal and provincial custody are Aboriginal. In Saskatchewan, 57% of the people in custody are Aboriginal. Bill C-10 is a continuation of the institutionalization of the Aboriginal people. First, we were ignored on reserves. Then, our children were placed in boarding schools. Now we are wards of a colonial office. Jail is just one more way of controlling and institutionalizing our people. This ongoing policy is an administration of failure by successive governments. Canada has a long history as a middle power that strongly supported the United Nations. Today, we are in violation of the basic tenets of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. We have slid shamefully a long way. The future appears hazy for BC's thriving underground pot industry, even as 2 U.S. states, Washington and Colorado, have voted to allow citizens to legally use the drug recreationally. Opinion on the impact varies widely, but those advocating for Canada to adopt a more evidence-based policy on marijuana says Tuesday votes mean Canada is falling behind the U.S. Indeed, on the same day as Washington and Colorado moved toward decriminalizing pot, the Harper government was bringing into force tough new mandatory penalties. Drug measures in the Conservative government's ominous Safe Streets and Communities Act, passed last spring, came into full force and effect. Canada's new law provides a mandatory 6-month jail term for growing as few as 6 marijuana plants, twice the mandatory minimum for luring a child to watch pornography or exposing oneself on a playground. How can they justify this insanity? Today our message is clear that if you are in business of producing, importing, or exporting drugs, you'll now face jail time. Justice Minister Rob Nicholson said in the statement today before the U.S. polls closed, while drinking cold beer with no worries. Hypocrite. Washington and Colorado voters passed ballot initiatives that remove criminal penalties for the possession and sale of recreational marijuana. Should the U.S. federal government not challenge the initiatives, which directly oppose federal rules, the states will begin regulating sales of the drug. This vote is obviously going to take that tool away, and I think has quite successfully quashed debate on this topic in Canada. A coalition called Stop the Violence BC contends prohibition of marijuana is a failed strategy that fuels bloody gang wars and facilitates the influx of guns and cocaine when it's traded into the U.S. via organized crime. But experts who believe it's hefty argue the market for well-known BC bud will shrink simply because it won't be in such high demand anymore in places like Washington, where the users will be able to make legal purchases.